get started, and basically we'll break in a little while, and I'll give out the graded essays. Just wait till there are more people in here. Let me go back a slide here. We saw when we looked at this that Bentham has a way of calculating things out, and he really didn't mean that now you're going to make these kinds of calculations for the simplest of things to decide whether to have dessert with dinner or something like that. But for weightier things, like something like building the Baku Dam, where you're affecting the lives of quite a few people, or consider a judge who has to, in the sentencing phase of a trial, mete out a sentence that is not too lenient, that doesn't accomplish the purposes of things like rehabilitation of the offender or deterrence. The sentence could be too lenient and it's not going to deter other people from committing the same crime. On the other hand, you don't want a sentence that's too harsh, that goes over the top. And so if maybe somebody's life, years of somebody's life were in the balance on the decision, what sentence to give somebody, then, would be a weighty situation where, I don't know why it is. This thing is not picking up. I mean, basically, there would be a situation where it might be worth going through some calculations. But again, we saw that calculations are hard to make because it's hard to assign exact values. And yet there are people like Peter Sanger who are old-fashioned Benthamite-type utilitarians who want to go by the original hedonistic standard and make utilitarian calculations that way. And so utilitarians often will forge ahead even in spite of the criticisms. So again, we saw standardizing on a unit like a hedon is pretty much a non-starter. I mean, how can you in any objective way say what's to count as one hedon's worth of pleasure or minus one hedon's worth of pain? I mean, it just is not practically feasible because of the subjective nature of pains and pleasures. And also there's, as I said, the problem of predicting future consequences, which we're going to also look at towards the end of this video. How do we make those estimations accurately? And in the real world, the answer is often we don't, and often we can't. I mean, look at the big dig in Boston. That big public transportation project that, they got seawater and stuff running into the subway tunnels and concrete falling down, and it went just massively over budget. So if you're going to calculate cost versus benefits, the cost of the thing turned out to be a whole lot more than any potential benefits. And again, we do make rough and ready comparisons, and I think for some utilitarians who know the criticisms about the fact that you probably can't get exact units, they'll say, but nonetheless, I mean, we can estimate things. We can get close enough. It does make sense to say my headache today is worse than the one I had yesterday. And so in a sort of rough and ready sense, we can talk about and compare pains and pleasures. But again, that we can do that doesn't mean that we can do it in exact units. So the big word to remember for Bentham is quantity of pleasure. In other words, that's what the numbers are supposed to measure. And for Bentham, see, he thought you could do this in a pretty simple, straightforward way and talk about all pains and pleasures being more or less equal as long as their quantity was the same. But we're going to see that this opened Bentham and utilitarianism up to some significant criticisms, which led Mill, John Stuart Mill, and it's Mill, not Mills with an S, to introduce, qualitative distinctions. But the problem is when you do that, you seem to abandon the simple hedonistic standard that both of them claimed they want to go by. So that's kind of where we're going. I think this one is dark. Someone turn out the light. Hopefully there's enough background light that when your eyes get adjusted a little bit, you'll be able to take notes. So Bentham, by the time significant criticisms were coming in against utilitarianism, Bentham was pretty old. And so John Stuart Mill was Bentham's star pupil. And he sort of took up the mantle for utilitarianism and took up its defense. And Bentham's claim that all pleasures are on a par as long as their quantity was the same opened this theory up to a lot of criticism, because he's saying, well, this gives us a very low view of human beings and of human nature. It views human beings as being mere creatures of pleasure and pain. And also, if all pleasures are on a par, and Bentham also thought that the pains and pleasures of non-human animals count. If the pig out there in the field gets as much pleasure from eating slop as you do from going to the symphony or something like that, or reading a novel or a book of poetry, then they're the same. So this is not something I made up. They actually said, well, this is kind of a pig morality. It reduces human beings in some way to the level of pigs if your claim is there's no significant difference between the pleasures that a human being can have and the pleasures that the pig out there in the field can have, then this gives us a very low view of human nature. And what John Stuart Mill tried to say in reply is that there are uniquely human pleasures that the pig out there in the field knows nothing of. And that it's not mere quantity, but the quality of pleasures that's important in utilitarian calculations. Now, I think Mill has a good point. One of his famous quotes, to paraphrase it, I don't have it, but he says something like, who would trade places with the beast or the pig out there in the field for, even if you were promised, I think he says it this way, the full allowance of a beast's pleasures. In other words, if somebody said, well, look, I know you got a lot of problems weighing down on you, and maybe you're not as happy and life is not as pleasurable as it could be, but I'll tell you what, I've been reading up, reading a book on magic, and I think I can pull it off. I think I can change you into a pig. And furthermore, I can promise you that you're going to be a very happy pig. You're going to have the full allowance of the pleasures that a pig can experience. And Mill basically says, which one of us would take that deal? And why wouldn't, and I presume the answer is no for all of us. And why wouldn't we? Because there are things that we can appreciate and experience as a human being that the pig knows nothing of. We can have, pleasures that the pig doesn't understand. And Mill says if the pig would disagree with us, it's only because the pig knows just one half of the matter, pleasures from its perspective. So in order to defend utilitarianism against these criticisms that it gives us a very low view of human nature, brings us down to the status of the pig in the field, Mill says we want qualitatively higher pleasures, and these he defines as the pleasures of the intellect and the imagination. I forget where I have this. In other words, pleasures like appreciating a work of art or appreciating an elegant mathematical proof, but also things like, enjoying the works that are created by human imagination, like, good music or poetry. And so he claimed uniquely human pleasures like music and poetry are more desirable even if they are lower in quantity. And this is something that effectively makes him abandon hedonism, because he says it's better to have less of a higher quality pleasure than more of low quality pleasures. And his famous quote on this is, "It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool or a pig satisfied." In other words, Socrates might have the pleasure of intellectual discussion with people, but still be dissatisfied overall. And of course, being dissatisfied is for folks who came in, I do have all the essays graded, but I'm going to wait till a few more people come in. So this is Mill's famous quote. But this seems to abandon hedonism, because what makes higher pleasures higher can't be pleasure alone. In other words, if it's more desirable to have a lower quantity of a higher quality pleasure, then what separates the two pleasures out is not just pleasure alone. What he's saying is, and what he's effectively doing is saying that these higher pleasures are more valuable, but if you ask why they're more valuable, well, if it's not that they're more valuable because there's a higher quantity of pleasure in them, then essentially you're away from pleasure as your standard, and you're saying what makes these higher level pleasures more desirable is something else. In other words, there's some other aspect of them that gives them their value, and what gives them more value is not just pleasure. Well, if you say that there are other things that are valuable in themselves other than pleasure or happiness, then you're effectively abandoning hedonism. So in trying to defend Bentham's original utilitarianism against criticisms, he effectively abandons hedonism. And hedonism, Bentham clearly adopts when he says that mankind is under the service of two masters, pain and pleasure, and it's for them alone to determine what we ought to do. Now, what makes one of these higher pleasures a higher pleasure? Well, as I said, they're supposedly the pleasures of the intellect and the imagination. But how do we tell whether we've got a higher pleasure if we're comparing two pleasures? Well, again, Mill says if the pig thinks it's better to be a happy pig and eat slop than to be able to appreciate stuff like poetry and intellectual pursuits, it's only because, as Mill says, the pig knows only part of the situation, half the situation, its side, the side of simple animal-type pleasures. So Mill says, if you want to find out which is the higher pleasure, you don't ask somebody like the pig who knows only part of the situation, but you ask the person who has experienced both. And they, by their choices and preferences, will tell you. Because Mill thinks that people are going to automatically choose the higher pleasures. But is that really the case? Sometimes we have cable. I don't too here, but over at Compton we have cable right into, you know, built right into the system. So, you know, I could show you a program on channel 45 if there were some. Now, sometimes I will come in the mornings before my 9 o'clock class, and one of the students will have it on, and they're never looking at PBS or something, you know, or A&E. You know, it's always something like Maury Povich, some show that caters to the absolute lowest common denominator in human nature. But it does raise the question. I mean, Mill got criticized for being an elitist because what kinds of pleasures for him are going to be the higher pleasures? Well, they're basically the kinds of pleasures that a sophisticated, well-educated 19th century intellectual is going to think are the higher pleasures, right? You know, reading good literature, reading poetry, you know, going to a symphony or opera or something like that. But do people prefer it? I had an incident, something that happened to me one time, a long time ago in the 90s, but it still is a good illustration of this. I remember I dragged somebody I happened to be dating at the time, and she was a teacher, so she'd probably been up since 5 in the morning, right? So she's fighting sleep. Dragged her to a classical guitar concert, right? I play guitar, not classical guitar, but I can appreciate, you know, the instrument really played by somebody who knows what they're doing. And so there's this little theater, I don't even know if it's still there. It was in the basement of the Walters Art Gallery downtown. Sat maybe 300 or 400 people. And so there were people, and I think it was on like a Friday night. Yeah, it must have been a Friday because she had taught school that day. And so here we are listening to this classical guitar concert. However, not too far away, farther downtown at the Civic Arena, they were having, I think, Super Slam 6 or something like, you know, they had from the WWF, the World Wrestling Federation, right? Now, one, I think there were probably a few more people down there than were at the concert that night. And number two, I'll bet you some of the people who were watching wrestling that night knew very well what classical guitar music sounded like. And yet it doesn't seem that they automatically had a preference for that. In other words, I think Mill is wrong in saying that you can tell the higher from the lower pleasures by asking the person who's experienced both, and they'll automatically go for the higher one. I think he is right that most of us are not going to trade places with the beasts of the field, because we know there are things that we can appreciate in life that the pig doesn't know anything about. You know, so Mill's test for separating out higher from lower pleasures doesn't seem to do the job. But at any rate, to say that you can have a lower quantity of a higher quality pleasure, and that's a desirable situation, a preferable situation, makes you ask, well, what makes these higher quality pleasures more valuable? But if it's not the quantity of pleasure, then you're getting away from pleasure as your standard. And effectively, that's what Mill does. Now, most contemporary utilitarians are pluralists as far as what they think is the standard for goodness. In other words, rather than just adopting the single standard of pleasure or happiness, which is what the hedonists would do. Most contemporary utilitarians overtly abandon hedonism and say, look, there are multiple things that are valuable in and of themselves. Things like knowledge is an unqualified good in and of itself. I mean, that's, for a long time, what underlied the whole educational philosophy of a university. That if knowledge was an unqualified good in itself, that the Chaucer scholar can walk just as high with his head or her head held just as high on campus as the physicist or the biologist. Because knowledge in the liberal arts was as valuable as knowledge in the sciences. But things like self-realization, the satisfaction of our own choices and preferences. There's a sub-branch of utilitarianism called preference utilitarianism. But all of these are adopted by people like Jonathan Glover and contemporary utilitarians as alternate standards. Now, like I say, Peter Singer, and remember, there is a recorded lecture, and it's a video of a lecture that was given right on this campus, where Peter Singer discussed an animal rights issue. He's also, besides being a utilitarian, rather ardent animal rights activist. And that's in line with Bentham, but he's kind of a Benthamite utilitarian. Bentham said about non-human animals, and compare this to what Aristotle and what Kant was saying. Well, we'll see that Kant agrees with Aristotle that we can draw the line at reason. But what Bentham says about non-human animals is what we ought to ask is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? Can they feel pain and pleasure? And if that's the case, then we have direct moral duties to non-human animals, and that's the starting point for a lot of defenders of animal rights, saying that they have nearly as many rights as human beings. Now, of course, there are problems with a view like this. One is, if you really believe that, then you ought to be advocating that we systematically eliminate predators from the ecosystem, like wolves, because they're preying on and killing and causing pain and suffering in other animals. So we ought to get them out of the system. But few, if any, animal rights activists advocate this. And where people have tried it, they found that the ecosystem does worse. And the reintroduction of things like wolves and eagles into the ecosystem has actually helped, not hurt. But at any rate, so contemporary utilitarians want more than just the old hedonistic standard, although there are exceptions like Peter Singer. So the modern utilitarians of pluralists overtly, in other words, unapologetically and openly abandon hedonism, and they deny the hedonist claim that pleasure is the only standard, that's the only thing valuable for its own sake. They think other things, like the things on the list you just saw, satisfaction of human preferences, knowledge, self-realization, those can be unqualified goods as well. Well, let me look at one. Oh, yeah. So pluralism is the way that many, respectable. Let me scroll around. I thought I had already done that. I put it out of sight, out of mind. And I'm going to stop in a few minutes and hand back the essays. I'm going to wait till we get more people in here. So contemporary utilitarians then abandon the simple hedonistic standard. And one of the things, though, that contemporary utilitarians also have done is marry some insights from economic theory, like a cost-benefit analysis, and tie that to their moral theory. So now it's not just prudent economically to choose the side that has, on balance, the most bang for the buck, the most benefits for the costs involved. If you tie a cost-benefit analysis to utilitarian theory, then basically it's our moral obligation to choose those actions which bring about on balance the most good for the money invested. Now, this is controversial in areas like healthcare. In the British healthcare system, which is a single payer system, that is, the government is the single payer of health bills. The insurance companies, for the most part, are cut out of it, although some survive. Basically, the cost of your procedure, if it's the government that's going to pay for it, is the cost to society. And so there are systems for rationing medical care based on a utilitarian reasoning and a cost-benefit analysis. I mean, nowadays, and even now, after Obamacare, I mean, if people need some procedures, Medicare will very often just, if it's what the doctors and the patient agree should be done, Medicare will pick up the tab. But we're going in the direction of saying, we're going in the direction of using something like a cost-benefit analysis to decide if it's going to cost us, $25,000 to give you this procedure. Are we good enough? Are we as a society going to get enough bang for the buck? If we save your life with this operation, are you going to continue to have? Now, the British system has is a system where it takes into account how long you're going to live, and what kind of quality of life you're going to have, quality adjusted. Life years. And they would like to adopt, some standard close to that in Obamacare. It's not there yet, but various things have been proposed. But quality, in other words, how long are you going to live and what kind of quality of life are you going to have, and is that going to justify this procedure? And of course, this is what the president is behind, right? There's that famous news interview where the president is asked by somebody who says, you know what, I have a 100-year-old mother, and she still has a lot of zest for life. What happens if she needs a life-saving procedure? Are you going to pay for it? And the president basically says, well, you know, there are some situations where we may just need to make somebody comfortable, give them something for the pain and not give them the procedure. One standard that's presupposed by Ezekiel Emanuel, who's a physician and the brother of the person who's now the mayor of Chicago, uses what they call a whole life system. And on that particular system, if you're over 75 years old, forget about it. We ain't throwing any money your way, no matter how much zest for life you have. Now I'm not saying that this is the system that has been adopted, but it's one that's been proposed, and it's similar to the British system. So, you know, the interesting thing about cost-benefit analysis is now we're using units that we can count and we can specify, right? We do know what a dollar is, what represents $1, whereas we might not be able to specify what a hedon is. Let me go pause this and give out there's some more technical stuff at the end that we may touch on briefly. So then a cost-benefit analysis, if it ties moral obligation to it, says the moral obligation we have is to go with the side that has the most benefits for the costs involved, you know, is basically, you know, utilitarian in nature. And a lot of government policy decisions are made this way. Well, what are some of the advantages of it? Well, you know, responding to Hume's skepticism about morality, that we can't really reason about moral matters, you know, this gets morality out of the realm of the supernatural and the otherworldly, and you know, morality is no longer following something like following God's commands or following abstract moral principles that might be built into the nature of things like Plato thought. But morality is more down to earth. It's just promoting pleasure or lessening the pain of real people, and for Bentham, real animals, in the world we actually live in. You know, and so this was one way that they hoped to get back what had been lost in Humean skepticism about morality, which is the ability to reason about moral right and wrong in an objective way, in a way that's not just relative to what a person believes, but that we can talk about what really is morally right or morally wrong. Now, one big advantage utilitarian has is it fully captures the notion that ideally we would like to make our decisions from, the word here is a disinterested perspective. That's not an uninterested perspective, but to be disinterested is to do what? Basically, I mean, if I take a disinterested perspective on something, well, it's basically to stand back and make my decision as if the decision does not affect me, as if I have no interests in the situation. Now, utilitarianism is not egoism, where egoism says the only interests that matter are my interests. But they're not the only things that matter. Bentham's famous quote on this, it sounds like the Three Musketeers. He says, each is to count as one and none for more than one. In other words, in utilitarian reasoning, I'm supposed to take an objective perspective that says, well, my interests matter, but no more than the interests of anyone else affected by my decision. Each is to count as one and none for more than one. So this makes reasoning about moral right and wrong straightforward and objective, views the right course of action as what gets the best results, what brings about the best consequences for all concerned. And as Peter Singer says, it recognizes that morality should make a difference in the world. And also, now, utilitarianism does have this aspect that Ross Harrison does a good job of pointing out. Real morality most often occasionally balances out the interests of the many against the interests of the few. Now, we saw that in that problem of whether or not to build the Bakun Dam, right? You're saying in order to promote the interests of the wider nation, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people who would benefit from having more electricity available and available at cheaper cost. I mean, people could have modern conveniences, might promote health better. You could also run factories. There would be jobs created. But in order to get those benefits, we may have to displace 10,000 native peoples. And it's consistent, as I think I said before, with the claim that you provided or promoted the greatest good for the greatest number, that some segment of the population may come out very badly indeed. I mentioned on the occasion before that I teach at Compton, which is down right in the heart of the city on North Avenue. And another real example of utilitarian reasoning as it affects us, and it's similar to this, is the use of eminent domain. What happens if the right of eminent domain is exercised by a governmental body, whether it be the city or what can you do? Well, when we moved, where I moved in 1955, I was a kid, obviously. And across the alley, it was in Baltimore City, there were some homes sitting there when we moved in. And shortly after we moved there, they were torn down. And for a while, there was nothing but an empty lot there, and that was fine with us as kids because we used to play on the empty lot. But then one summer, all this equipment was moved in, and they basically gouged out that whole area, put the dirt across the street in what was then a reservoir, filled it in, and now it's ball diamonds. And where those homes once stood is now the Falls Road off-ramp going north for the Jones Falls Expressway. Suppose those people didn't want to leave their homes. Well, eminent domain says the state can force them, or the city can force them, to do so against their will. Now, in theory, they're supposed to be compensated in a moral way, but people don't often feel like they're compensated for their trouble. You know, and the state can take over that land for the common good, right? For something like an off-ramp that benefits everyone, or a school, or a government building. There's a whole square block of housing that was there 3 years ago, and now none of those homes exist, and they're building a new a new STEM building, science, technology, engineering, and math, right, for Coppin University. And so those, what if some of those homeowners didn't want to leave? Didn't matter. For the common good, so you're balancing out the mental pain and suffering, and maybe the economic hurt of a subsegment of the population, the people who lived in those homes, over against the greater good of, you know, building a new building for university that hopefully will help a lot of people down the road. So it's utilitarian reasoning. It's balancing out benefits versus costs. But, you know, the criticism is that this infringes on some people's basic rights, like their property rights, you know, and maybe even their right to life. So there are objections to utilitarian reasoning. One is that it requires too much of us, that it's not as straightforward and simple as it's made up to be, because predicting future consequences can be a very difficult thing. What factors are relevant factors to take into account in building something like the Bakun Dam, you know? Is it a loss that various skills are lost? What if you're clearing areas of rainforest, you know, that may destroy a plant species that if it were left alone, people would discover a drug, whether it's the cure for cancer or something else. I mean, you know, deciding on the moral relevance of specific consequences is problematic. And also, if you're trying to predict others' pleasures and pains, that's a problematic thing too. We saw that those native villagers, not all of them thought it was a great thing to be relocated to the city. You know, they would rather stay in their own comfortable way of life. You know, it's a big stretch. So predicting future consequences is hard, and because people's private mental states are unobservable, we can only estimate pains and pleasures. Also, sometimes we're comparing very diverse things. Suppose you like a new widescreen TV for football in the fall, and you say, I could get it, but I'd have to work a lot of overtime at a job I don't particularly care for. So you're balancing the extra pain and discomfort of working more hours than you want to at a job you don't particularly like, over against the benefit of now being able to afford the widescreen TV. Or, you know, but how do you compare one with the other? You know, or the pleasure of a steak dinner versus enjoying a movie. We do make these decisions, but there's not an objective, straightforward way of comparing very diverse sorts of pleasures. Now, here's, I'm not going to dwell on this, but it's worth pointing out. One article we used to read by Peter Singer argued that, let's talk about that widescreen TV. I suppose you're going to get a good one. Now, it used to be a good one was $3,000 or $4,000 or more, but let's suppose you're going to spend $1,500, $2,000. Right? Well, you're going to get increased pleasure out of it, and maybe your buddies who come over to watch football, if you're a guy. But suppose that same $1,500 or $2,000 were given to, say, famine relief or some other worthy cause in a developing nation, like putting in wells for people. Isn't it arguable that you would produce more good on balance than the good you're going to bring to yourself and your buddies by buying the TV to give the money instead to something like third world famine relief? And Peter Singer essentially argues that if you want to be a good utilitarian like Bentham is, you'll see yourself not as just having that option. See, a discretionary duty is something where it's nice if you do that, nice if you give some clothes to the Purple Heart when they call you up and want to send a truck around to pick up some donation. Say, well, I can, or I can decide not to, but I'm not obligated. Or the post office is having a food drive, and say, well, leave some canned goods out with your mail, and you say, well, okay, maybe I'll do that, maybe I won't, but most of us would figure that's a discretionary thing. We're not morally obligated to give a couple of cans of food to the post office when they do their food drive. But Singer argues that these become mandatory duties morally if our number one governing principle is to promote the greatest good for the greatest number, and if that is better done by taking the money and giving it to third world famine relief than buying the new flat screen TV, then so much for the flat screen TV. And so this becomes a criticism of the theory, because people say, well, your moral theory is making something mandatory that really should be discretionary. And as I said, it might force us to abandon rights like our property rights for what is claimed to be the common good. The slippery slope argument against legalizing active euthanasia. Passive euthanasia is where you let somebody die. You unplug the respirator and let nature take its course. Active euthanasia is where you give somebody something that is going to actively bring about their death. Now, the former is legal, the latter is not. Although, we're very close to it. You can't give somebody, say, an overdose of a drug that's going to kill them for the purpose of killing them. But in a hospice, it's morally and legally acceptable to give somebody huge doses of, say, heroin or morphine or something to treat their pain and suffering, when you know that effectively this is bringing also about a much sooner death for them. Very, very fine line between active and passive euthanasia. But one of the arguments against legalizing it objectively and openly across the board is, what if people are pressured to do the right thing? And this is, part of the purpose of end-of-life counseling, to let that decision be a much more palatable decision for somebody to make. Kind of brainwashed them, thinking, well, euthanasia, not a bad thing. And so the thing is, the slippery slope argument is that a terminally ill patient could, at some point, be actively euthanized against their will. Now a slippery slope argument is controversial logically, because it isn't always true that if you start a policy in one direction, that it's going to go all the way to the most extreme, causal end. But the argument against legalizing active euthanasia is maybe you're going to get to the point where people are going to be involuntarily euthanized, and that's not a good thing. So another thing is that utilitarianism may recommend what a lot of people think of as immoral actions. Now, I already talked that we might violate other people's rights. James Rachels gives an example where a woman, a rape suspect, came to a local sheriff's office to report a rape, and professionally the guy said, well, we need evidence, we're going to have to take some photos, and I don't know whether a woman took the photos or not, but the point is, these were photos of her unclothed, basically, to show, some signs of what had taken place, but the photos were distributed amongst the law enforcement officers in the local thing. And you say, now, that seems wrong. But you could say, well, wait a second. Now, when she found out about it, this caused a lot of anguish and pain and suffering in her. But what if that's more than balanced out by the additional pleasure that these people had from viewing the new photographs? Wouldn't utilitarianism justify that? And you would say, why should the pleasure they might get from an action like that have anything to do with deciding the morality of this? Right? Because most of us would think that's crazy. You can say, well, among other things, what's wrong about it is her rights to privacy have been egregiously violated by what the person did, and balancing out, pains and pleasures, her pain versus the pleasure of somebody viewing the photographs doesn't even come into play. So you can say utilitarianism is off base here in how it would view that kind of a situation. Richard Taylor, a utilitarian, argues from kind of a Benthamite perspective that if somebody gets more pleasure out of having affairs than the alternative, then go for it. You know, but not everybody believes that openly advocating adultery as a moral option for us is the right way to go. You know, but he can say, well, if it produces more pleasure than the negative, go for it. And you can say, well, certainly if somebody's spouse finds out, that's going to cause a lot of mental anguish. Well, Richard Taylor goes on to argue that that means that on utilitarian grounds we're justified in lying to our spouse about the affair. Utilitarianism can, you know, if lying produces more good than bad results, then lying is the thing to do. You know, but not everybody agrees that that's the right way to look at things morally. So utilitarianism can be very controversial in some of the actions it seems to morally recommend. We're breaking a promise. Now, here we look at backward-looking reasons. Remember, one criticism of utilitarianism is utilitarianism makes the past irrelevant from a moral perspective. And I said that as much when I talked about consequences. In other words, as a consequentialist theory, it says the only factors that take into account are the possible future results of our choices. But if somebody made a promise and now they're thinking about whether or not they ought to keep it, when was that promise made? Well, it was made in the past. You know, but something like keeping a promise is made irrelevant. And again, there's a contrived example that shows how utilitarian reasoning could say that our moral duty is to break a promise. Suppose somebody has $50,000 stuck in his mattress, and you're there by their bedside, and he knows he's dying, and he's got one nephew, his only living relative, and but the guy's kind of a playboy type, and you know he's going to kind of squander the money. But the person says, I want you to promise to take that $50,000 and give it to him. Now, let's suppose that keeping it yourself is not an option for you. You're a Benthamite utilitarian. You want to do the right thing. Well, isn't it arguable that you would produce, on balance, a lot more overall good if you were to take that money and instead of keeping your promise to the dying man to give it to his profligate nephew, his playboy nephew, instead, after having made the promise, you break it and give it to something like, you know, a children's hospital, or, you know. And so utilitarianism would say, well, the right thing to do is to break the promise. And now, there's a distinction that we're not going to worry about. I have it in these slides, because remember, I use these slides in other situations where we go into things in more detail. The difference between act and rule utilitarianism, and some people argue that can deal with some of the objections. If you're curious, you can look at the slides. I'm not going to worry about that distinction for the 101 level. We're going to kind of go to Kantian stuff. We'll look at a video on Kant, if I remember to put him back in my briefcase. So anyway, those are some of the pros and cons of utilitarianism. But whether we agree with it or disagree with it
It's a tremendously influential moral theory, and you know, there are people making decisions that affect all of our lives who are doing so by utilitarian reasoning. So whether you agree with it or not, it's worth knowing a little bit about it. Okay, if someone has the role, if anyone missed it, also if you have your paper, turn it in on the way out, and that's great that you do. So you're dismissed. Look, have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Tuesday.